Alaska isn't just cold, it's alive. Out here, where the wind carries whispers and the nights stretch longer than time itself, people vanish, shadows move on their own, and something ancient watches from the snow. Tonight, we travel into the frozen heart of America's last wilderness, where every story ends in a shiver, and every scream is swallowed by the dark. Welcome to Midnight Whispers Stories. Story 1. Thing I made from snow. Have you ever been so alone that you did talk to anything just to hear a voice answer back, even if that voice belonged to something you built with your own hands? I found a journal in an abandoned cabin deep in the Alaska range, and what I read inside changed everything I thought I knew about isolation, madness, and the terrifying things that can happen when loneliness becomes something physical. My name is Tommy Lawson, and I am a wilderness guide based out of Tahkeetna. I've spent 20 years leading hunters and tourists through some of the most remote terrain in Alaska, places where civilization is just a distant memory and nature still holds absolute power. But nothing in those 2 decades prepared me for what I discovered last spring in a rotting cabin at the edge of the Alaska range, or for the horrifying truth behind what locals call the cabin fever incident of 1983. The cabin belonged to a trapper named Vincent Cole, a man who spent 30 winters alone in the wilderness, someone who supposedly knew every trick for surviving the isolation and darkness that drives most people crazy after just a few months. In March of '83, when spring thaw finally arrived and the supply plane could land again, they found Vincent dead in his cabin. The official report said heart failure, but the locals whispered about something else, something far more disturbing that the authorities didn't want to investigate too closely. I found the cabin by accident while scouting new routes for next season. The structure was half collapsed, the roof caved in on one side, windows broken and covered with moss. Most of Vincent's belongings had been removed decades ago, but something made me search more carefully, made me pull up the loose floorboards and check the spaces underneath. That's where I found it. A leather journal wrapped in plastic, hidden away like a secret Vincent didn't want anyone to find but couldn't bring himself to destroy. The first entries were normal enough. Vincent documenting his trap lines, noting weather patterns, describing the animals he caught and the meals he prepared. Standard wilderness journal stuff. But around December, 6 weeks into the long Arctic winter, the tone began to change. He started writing about the silence, how it pressed against his ears like physical weight, how the darkness seemed to have texture and presence. He wrote about talking to himself just to hear a human voice, about how his own words sounded strange and foreign after days without speaking. That's when he built the snowman. Not as a joke or a decoration, but out of desperate need for company, for something that looked human, for a presence that might make the cabin feel less empty. He described it in careful detail. 7 feet tall, built from the packed snow outside his door, with stones for eyes and a twisted branch for a mouth. He even gave it a name, Matthew, after his brother who died 20 years earlier. At first, it was just something to talk to, a way to maintain his sanity by pretending he had company. Vincent would sit on his porch and tell Matthew about his day, about the animals he trapped, about memories from his past. He knew it was strange, but he told himself lots of isolated people talk to inanimate objects. It was harmless, normal, even. The entries grew more unsettling after that. Vincent started describing how Matthew seemed different each morning, how the snowman, this expression appeared to change, how sometimes the branch mouth looked like it was smiling and other times like it was screaming. He convinced himself it was just the light, the way shadows fell across the snow, his mind playing tricks after too many weeks alone. Then, in early January, Vincent wrote something that made my blood run cold. He heard Matthew speak, not out loud, but inside his head, a voice that was familiar and strange at the same time, that sounded like his dead brother but wrong, distorted, like a recording played backward and then forward again. The voice thanked him for giving it form, for building it a body, for providing the attention and belief that allowed it to become real. I should have stopped reading right there. I should have burned that journal and forgotten I'd ever found it. But I couldn't. He stopped. The entries became increasingly frantic. Vincent's handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scrawls as he described his conversations with Matthew, how the snowman asked questions about his life, his fears, his deepest regrets. At first, the questions seemed innocent, almost therapeutic, like talking to a counselor. But they grew more invasive, more demanding, probing into memories Vincent had spent decades trying to forget. Matthew wanted to know about Vincent, his brother, about the real Matthew who died. He wanted every detail, every memory, every secret. And Vincent, desperate for companionship, desperate for something to break the crushing loneliness, told him everything. He confessed things he never told another living soul, guilt and shame and horrible truths that poured out of him in the darkness, with that snow figure standing silent and patient outside his door. But Matthew wasn't satisfied with just listening. The journal entries described how the snowman started making demands. Small things at first. Vincent had to visit him every hour, had to bring food and place it at his feet like an offering, had to build him larger, taller, more elaborate. Vincent complied, telling himself it was just a game to pass the time, a way to keep his mind occupied during the endless winter. The demands escalated. Matthew wanted Vincent to sleep outside, to prove his devotion by enduring the killing cold. He wanted Vincent to hurt himself, small cuts at first, then deeper wounds, blood offerings that Vincent was supposed to drip onto the snow at Matthew, his base. The journal entries from this period were terrifying. Vincent describing how he couldn't refuse, how Matthew, this voice in his head had become too loud to ignore, too powerful to resist. By February, Vincent wasn't sleeping anymore. He wrote about how Matthew was always watching, always talking, the voice never stopping even when Vincent begged for silence. The snowman had grown massive, towering over the cabin, its form twisted and wrong, the stone eyes seeming to follow Vincent's every movement. And it had changed in other ways too. The snow that formed its body had taken on a yellowish tint, and there were dark streaks running through it that looked disturbingly like veins. The most chilling entries came in late February. Vincent described how Matthew had started moving. Not much, just small adjustments in position, but enough to prove it was real, that whatever Vincent had created or summoned or awakened was no longer bound by the laws of normal reality. He wrote about waking up to find the snowman standing at his window, looking in, the branch mouth opened wide in what might have been a grin or a scream. Matthew told Vincent the truth then. The thing wearing his brother, his name wasn't to his brother, had never been his brother. It was something else. Something old and patient and hungry that existed in the spaces between human perception and reality. The isolation had thinned the barriers. Vincent's desperate need for companionship had given it an anchor, and his attention and belief had fed it, made it strong enough to take physical form. And now it wanted more. It wanted Vincent completely. It wanted him to walk outside, to embrace the snowman, to let the cold take him, to become part of the snow itself. The journal entries describe Vincent fighting this compulsion, barricading himself inside the cabin, trying everything to break free from Matthew's control. But the voice was everywhere, in his head, in the wind, in the creaking of the cabin walls. The final entry was dated March 1st, written in shaky handwriting that barely looked human. Vincent wrote that he couldn't fight anymore, that Matthew's voice had become his own thoughts, that he couldn't tell where his mind ended and the thing outside began. He described how peaceful the cold looked, how Matthew promised warmth and companionship and an end to the terrible loneliness if Vincent would just step outside and accept his embrace. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page like Vincent had simply stopped existing in the middle of writing. The next page was blank except for a single line written in different handwriting, cleaner and more controlled. It said, "Thank you for the company. I'll be waiting for the next one." I looked up from the journal to find that it was getting dark outside. I'd been reading for hours, so absorbed in Vincent's nightmare that I lost track of time. That's when I noticed something through the cabin, this broken window. A figure standing in the clearing, tall and white, catching the last rays of sunset. My rational mind said it was just an oddly shaped tree stump or a rock formation. But my gut knew better. I left that cabin at a dead run, not caring about my gear or supplies or anything except getting away from that place. I hiked through the night, using my headlamp to navigate terrain that should have been impossible in darkness, driven by a fear I couldn't fully explain. And the whole time, I felt something watching me, following me, matching my pace through the forest. When I finally reached my truck at dawn, I turned back to look at the trail behind me. There, barely visible in the morning light, was a line of marks in the snow. Not footprints exactly, but depressions, like something heavy had been dragging itself through the drifts. Following my path with patient determination, I drove straight to the authorities and turned in Vincent's journal. They took it, filed a report, and told me the case was closed. Had been closed for 40 years. They weren't interested in reopening it based on the ravings of a man who clearly suffered severe cabin fever and hypothermia. But I saw something in the deputy's eyes when I mentioned the snowman, a flicker of recognition and fear that told me I wasn't the first person to find that journal, wasn't the first person to report something impossible in those woods. I haven't been back to that area since. I turned down every guiding job that would take me anywhere near the Alaska range, invented excuses and lost clients rather than risk another encounter with whatever Vincent created. But the thing that haunts me most, I said, what I saw or what I read. It is a detail I noticed in the journal that I can't stop thinking about. Vincent wasn't the first. Throughout his entries, he mentioned finding strange marks in the snow, old depressions arranged in circles around his cabin, as if something had been standing guard there for years before he arrived. And in the very first pages of the journal, before the winter even started, he'd written about finding a smaller journal buried under the floorboards, notes from a trapper who lived in that cabin decades earlier, who also written about building a snowman for company, about how it came to life and demanded things. The pattern goes back further than I want to know. That cabin has been cursed since someone first built it. Maybe since before that. Since the first human looked at the snow and saw a blank canvas for their loneliness. And every few decades, someone desperate and isolated enough gives the thing what it needs: attention, belief, companionship. And it uses that connection to become real again, to feed on human contact and human fear before returning to whatever frozen dimension it calls home. Sometimes, on winter nights when the snow is falling heavy and the world feels empty and silent, I think about Matthew. I think about what Vincent created and what it might have truly been. And I wonder how many other isolated people, scattered across the frozen wilderness, are talking to things they built from snow, giving life to ancient hungers that wait patiently in the cold for someone lonely enough to let them in. The deputy told me one more thing before I left, something off the record that he made me promise never to repeat. Every winter, they get reports from isolated cabins and research stations across Alaska. People claiming they built snowmen that came to life, that started making demands, that trapped them in conversations that slowly eroded their sanity. The reports always stop in early spring. When the authorities investigate, they usually find bodies, victims of exposure or madness. But never the snowmen. Those always melt away without a trace, leaving nothing but depressions in the snow and journals filled with increasingly desperate entries. So here is my question for you. And I need you to really think about this. If you found yourself alone for months in a frozen wilderness, would you build something for company? Would you give form to your loneliness, knowing it might be exactly what something hungry and ancient was waiting for? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if anyone else understands the danger of filling the silence, of giving shape to the emptiness that surrounds us when we truly alone. Story 2. Figure on Kasugi Ridge. What could make 9 experienced hikers tear through their own tent from the inside and run screaming into the Alaskan wilderness to their deaths? I am a search and rescue coordinator for Denali State Park, and they spent 15 years pulling lost hikers off mountains, finding confused tourists who wandered off trails, recovering bodies from avalanches and falls. I thought I'd seen every way the wilderness could kill a person. Then I found the camp on Kasugi Ridge, and I realized that sometimes people aren't running from the cold or the terrain. They're running from something else. Something that stands just outside the firelight, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to step closer. This happened 4 months ago, but I still wake up screaming, still see those faces in my nightmares, still hear the sound of fabric tearing in the darkness. And the most terrifying part is that I think it's still out there, still waiting on that ridge for the next group of hikers who dawn. Do you know what they walking into? The call came in on a Tuesday morning in early March. A hiking group of 9 people, all experienced backcountry enthusiasts, had missed their scheduled check-in by 24 hours. Their emergency beacon wasn't responding. Family members were worried because this group was professional, the kind of people who never missed a check-in, who planned everything down to the last detail. We launched the search immediately. Weather conditions were decent, clear skies, and relatively mild temperatures for Alaska in March. We took 2 helicopters up to Kasugi Ridge, a beautiful but isolated stretch of wilderness with stunning views of Denali. The hikers had permits for a 4-day trek along the ridge trail, camping at designated sites. We found their camp from the air. The bright orange tent stood out against the white snow, but something about it looked wrong even from a distance. The fabric was shredded, flapping in the wind like torn flags. And around it, I could see dark shapes in the snow. Too many shapes, too still. We landed 50 yards away and approached on foot. The scene was one of the most disturbing things they ever witnessed. And they seen plenty of death in my career. But this was different. This was wrong on a level that made my instincts scream danger even though there was no apparent threat. The 9 hikers were dead, arranged in a tight circle about 30 feet from their destroyed tent. They were facing outward, backs pressed together, like they'd been defending against something coming from all directions. They weren't wearing proper winter gear, most of them in just base layers and socks, even though the temperature that night had dropped to well below zero. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with fear that had followed them into death. The tent had been torn apart from the inside. Long gashes in the fabric, the kind made by knives or sharp tools, all slicing outward like the occupants had been desperate to escape. Gear was scattered everywhere, sleeping bags and backpacks thrown aside in obvious panic. But here is the chilling detail that made my blood run cold. Their boots were still neatly lined up outside the tent entrance. These people had torn through their shelter and run into deadly cold in their socks, too terrified to take the 3 seconds needed to put on footwear. My team and I processed the scene, documenting everything, trying to piece together what had happened. We found no signs of animal attack, no tracks except those of the hikers themselves. No evidence of avalanche or weather event. No carbon monoxide poisoning possible in an open tent. Nothing that explained why 9 intelligent, experienced people would destroy their own shelter and run to their deaths. Then one of my team members found the camera, a digital SLR, partially buried in snow near the tent. The memory card was intact, protected by the camera, its waterproof housing. We reviewed the photos on site, hoping for clues about what had gone wrong. The first dozen images were normal. Beautiful landscape shots, group photos, candid moments around the campfire. The hikers looked happy and relaxed, enjoying their adventure. But the later photos showed a change. In shots taken that evening, you could see tension in people's faces, worried glances toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Then came the final photo, the last image captured before everything went wrong. It was taken at night, the flash illuminating the interior of the tent and the terrified faces of people who knew something was very wrong. But in the background, visible through the tent, this mesh window, there was something else. A tall, dark figure standing just outside the camp. Barely visible, more of a shadow than a solid shape, but definitely there. And definitely not human. The proportions were wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Arms too long, hanging past where knees should be. The head was an odd shape, elongated or misshapen, though the image was too dark and grainy to make out details. But what made my skin crawl was the posture. It wasn't the stance of an animal or a confused person. It was the stance of something watching, studying, deciding when to act. I've spent my entire career in Alaska wilderness. I know bears, wolves, moose, every animal that could potentially threaten hikers. This was none of them. This was something else. And whatever it was had scared 9 competent adults so badly they'd rather face certain death from exposure than stay in their tent one more second. We recovered the bodies and closed the investigation as deaths due to exposure and hypothermia, precipitated by unknown psychological distress. The official report was deliberately vague because we had no good answers. The photo was classified and removed from public record. Families were told their loved ones had likely experienced mass panic due to an animal encounter, though we all knew that explanation didn't fit the evidence. But I couldn't let it go. I started researching similar incidents, digging through old park records and newspaper archives. What I found was a pattern that stretched back decades. Every 7 to 10 years, there was a similar incident on Kasugi Ridge or nearby trails. Hikers found dead from exposure, their camps destroyed from within, expressions of terror on their faces. Local Alaska Native communities had stories about the ridge, about something that hunted there, something tall and dark that appeared to people in their dreams before coming for them in reality. The elders called it the stalker. They said it was ancient, older than the mountains, something that existed before humans came to Alaska and would exist long after we were gone. It didn't hunt for food. It hunted because it enjoyed the fear, enjoyed watching people realize they were being pursued by something impossible. The old stories said it would stand outside camps at night, just beyond the firelight, letting itself be glimpsed but never clearly seen. It would stay there for hours, watching, until the fear became unbearable and people ran. I dismissed the legends as folklore, the kind of stories every wilderness area accumulates. But then I went back to the ridge. I needed to see the site again, to understand what had happened. I went alone, which was stupid and against every safety protocol, but I needed to be there without distractions. I reached the campsite on the third evening. The tent was gone, the site cleared, but I could still see where it had stood, a patch of flattened snow and disturbed ground. I set up my own small tent as darkness fell, telling myself I was conducting a professional investigation, trying to experience what the hikers had experienced. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, the kind of beautiful Alaskan night that makes you understand why people love this place. I made a small fire and sat watching the darkness beyond its light, thinking about those 9 dead hikers and what they'd seen in their final moments. That is when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not the vague paranoia that comes from being alone in wilderness, but the absolute certainty that something was out there in the darkness, looking at me with intention and intelligence. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. Nothing, just shadows and snow and the wind moving through bare branches. But the feeling didn't go away. It intensified. I could feel eyes on me, could sense something standing just beyond my vision, studying me the way a scientist studies a specimen. I stayed by the fire, feeding it constantly, keeping the flames high and bright. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I was exhausted but too frightened to sleep, too aware of the presence circling my camp. Then, around 3 a.m., I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the tree line. Tall, impossibly tall, moving with a smooth gliding motion that didn't look like walking. It stopped about 50 feet away, just at the edge of my firelight, and I got the same impression from the photo. Wrong proportions, arms too long, head misshapen. It stood there motionless, and even though I couldn't make out features, I knew it was looking directly at me. Terror hit me like a physical force, not the healthy fear that makes you careful in dangerous situations, but primal, overwhelming dread that shut down rational thought. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to tear through my tent and sprint into the darkness, anything to get away from that watching presence. I understood in that moment why those hikers had destroyed their shelter, why they run without boots. The fear wasn't irrational. It was something deeper, something hardwired into human DNA, the recognition that you in the presence of a predator perfectly designed to hunt you. But I forced myself to stay still. I kept my eyes on the figure, feeding the fire, refusing to give it what it wanted. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, locked in a contest of wills. The shadow watching me watching it back. The only sound was the crackling of flames in my own shallow breathing. Then, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, it moved. Not away, but closer, 3 steps forward, each one deliberate, bringing it into better light. I saw details I wish I could forget. The elongated head wasn't misshapen. It was a skull, stretched and wrong, with dark hollow eyes. The arms weren't just long. They had too many joints, bending in places arms shouldn't bend. And the hands, God, the hands were massive, fingers like branches ending in points that could have torn through tent fabric like paper. It took another step, then stopped. And I realized why. Sunlight was spreading across the ridge, morning chasing away the night. The figure watched the growing light, then looked back at me one final time. I felt something pass between us, an understanding. It had tested me and found me unsatisfying. I hadn't run, hadn't given it the fear-driven chase it wanted. But there would be other hikers, other camps, other chances. It turned and glided back into the trees, moving impossibly fast for something so large, disappearing into the forest like smoke dissolving in wind. I packed my gear and left the ridge that morning. I filed a report recommending the area be closed for public safety, but my superiors denied the request. They said there wasn't sufficient evidence of danger, that I likely seen a bear or moose distorted by darkness and fear. But they know right? They see the pattern. They just don't. They want to admit that something impossible is hunting on that ridge. 3 weeks ago, another hiking group went missing on Kasugi Ridge. We found their camp destroyed, tent torn from inside, gear scattered in panic. But this time, we found the bodies. They were still out there somewhere, and terrified we'll find them arranged in that same circle, faces frozen in terror, having run from something that has been waiting on that ridge for longer than any of us can imagine. So here is my question for you. If something stands outside your tent in the darkness, something that shouldn't exist, something that wants nothing more than to watch you break and run, would you have the strength to face it down? Or would you do what instinct demands and flee into the night, knowing it means your death but unable to stop yourself? Write your answer in the comments, because I honestly don't know if to be strong enough to resist a second time. Story 3. Shadow Plague of Fort Yukon, 1961. My shadow stopped following me and started leading me, pulling me toward places I didn't want to go, and when I tried to step away from it, it reached out and grabbed me with fingers that felt like ice water and broken glass. I was 43 years old when the Shadow Plague began in Fort Yukon, and I have spent the last 62 years trying to understand what happened during that horrifying week when the darkness consumed us all. The question I am asking you to answer in the comments is this: if your own shadow turned against you, if the darkness that follows you everywhere became something alive and hostile, where would you run when darkness is inescapable? My name is William Pierce, and I'm one of the last surviving witnesses to what happened in Fort Yukon during the summer of 1961. I'm telling this story now because I'm running out of time. My heart is weak. The doctors have given me maybe a year left, and I can bear the thought of taking this knowledge to my grave without at least attempting to share it with anyone who might listen and believe and understand the terrifying reality of what can happen when nature itself turns against us in ways that defy explanation. Fort Yukon is a small town in Alaska, situated on the Yukon River, surrounded by vast forests and tundra. In 1961, it was an even smaller and more isolated community than it is today, with only a few hundred residents who had chosen to live in one of the most remote and unforgiving places on Earth. Most of us were there because we wanted to escape something. We wanted solitude. We wanted to live away from the complications of civilization. We wanted to disappear into the wilderness and forget about the rest of the world. What we didn't understand was that the wilderness had its own ways of disappearing, its own ways of erasing us from existence. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in early June. I remember it clearly because I had just stepped outside of my cabin to begin my day, and I noticed something odd about my shadow on the ground. It wasn't quite right. The proportions were wrong. My shadow was stretched out and elongated, far longer than it should have been given the angle of the sun, and it seemed to be moving slightly out of sync with my own movements. I remember thinking that I must be tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me, that I was seeing things that weren't really there. I went about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Every time I looked at my shadow, it seemed to be doing something that my body wasn't doing. Twitching, shifting, moving with a life of its own. That afternoon, I ran into my neighbor, a man named Henry Blackwood, at the general store. Henry looked terrible. His face was pale and drawn, and his hands were shaking. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His shadow had attacked him. He said he had been working in his garden that morning, pulling weeds, and he had noticed his shadow moving strangely on the ground. At first, he had thought it was funny. He had tried to stay still to see if his shadow would move independently. And that's when it happened. The shadow had reached out and grabbed his leg. Henry had felt something cold and sharp wrap around his calf, squeezing with terrible force. He had screamed and tried to run, but his shadow had followed him, striking at him, trying to pull him back down to the ground. Henry had managed to get inside his house and close the door. When he looked down at his leg, there were marks on his skin. Deep, terrible marks that looked like fingerprints or claw marks, marks that could not have been made by anything human or natural. I didn't believe him. I thought he was joking or that he had experienced some kind of psychological episode. But over the next few hours, more reports started coming in. Other people in Fort Yukon were reporting the same terrifying experience. Their shadows were moving independently. Their shadows were attacking them, and the marks left by the shadow attacks were becoming increasingly severe and increasingly horrifying. By evening, the town was in a state of panic. People were gathering in the church, the one place where many of them felt safe. The preacher, an old man named Reverend Matthews, was trying to comfort them, but even he seemed uncertain and afraid. He kept talking about demons and spiritual forces, but even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. This didn't feel like something that religion could explain or combat. I went home and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay in bed, staring at the wall, listening to the creeping silence of the Arctic night. And then I heard it, a sound like footsteps moving across my floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned on the light and looked around my cabin. There was nothing there, but the sound continued. Footsteps moving through my home. Footsteps that seemed to be made by something that had weight and substance, but that was completely invisible. And then I saw my shadow on the wall. It was moving independently of me. I was lying absolutely still in bed, but my shadow was standing up, moving around the room, pacing back and forth like something trapped in a cage. It had a shape and a form, but it seemed to be separated from my body by a barrier that I couldn't see or understand. I leapt out of bed and ran to the door. My shadow followed me, moving with terrifying speed, and I felt something cold grab at my ankle just as I reached the door. I screamed and kicked backward, feeling my foot connect with something solid, something that felt like flesh and bone but that looked like nothing but darkness. I ran out into the street, and I was not alone. Other people had fled their homes for the same reason. The streets of Fort Yukon were filled with terrified residents, all of them trying to escape from their shadows, all of them running in different directions, all of them seeking some kind of sanctuary from the darkness that was pursuing them. Fires were lit in the town square. People gathered around the flames, believing that the light would protect them from their shadows. And for a moment, it seemed to work. The shadows seemed to retreat, unable to attack when they were illuminated by the bright flames. But as the night wore on, the shadows began to adapt. They grew longer and more distorted in the firelight, and they began to attack from unexpected angles, striking at people from shadows that seemed to exist in places where shadows shouldn't exist. By midnight, the first death had occurred. A man named Thomas Caldwell had been overwhelmed by his shadow. It had wrapped around his body like a living thing, squeezing him, suffocating him. By the time people could reach him and try to help, he was already dead. The marks on his body were horrifying. It looked as though something had tried to pull him into itself, as though his shadow had attempted to merge with him and consume him. The panic became absolute. People were screaming. People were running into the forest, hoping to escape, hoping that somehow, away from human civilization, away from the structures and the buildings that cast shadows, they might find safety. But the shadows followed them. The shadows followed everyone, because as long as there was light, there would be shadows, and the shadows were no longer bound by the laws of nature. I found myself in a small group of survivors who had taken shelter in the church. We had boarded up all the windows and doors. We had lit every candle and lantern we could find, turning the interior of the church into a blazing beacon of light. And we told ourselves that we were safe. We told ourselves that the shadows couldn't reach us here. We told ourselves that help would come, that someone from Anchorage or Fairbanks would realize that something was wrong and would send rescue. But we were lying to ourselves. Over the next 2 days, more people died. Their shadows attacked them in the night. Their shadows came for them while they slept. Their shadows wrapped around them and pulled them down into a darkness that none of us could fully comprehend. The bodies were piling up, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The darkness of the Arctic night, which normally provided us with a kind of shelter and comfort, had become something terrifying and threatening. Because in the darkness, the shadows were everywhere. They were not bound to the ground anymore. They moved through the air like things with wings. They attacked from angles that should have been impossible. And they were growing stronger. And then, on the evening of the 7th day of the plague, something happened that nobody could have predicted. A solar storm hit Earth. A massive coronal mass ejection from the sun filled the atmosphere with particles that disrupted the normal patterns of light. The sky turned dark. Not the normal darkness of the Arctic night, but an absolute, complete darkness in the middle of the day. The sun was blocked out. The stars were invisible. There was no light anywhere. No light meant no shadows. And when there were no shadows, the attacks stopped. For 3 days, the town of Fort Yukon was plunged into absolute darkness. And during those 3 days, the shadow plague ended. The shadows simply disappeared. They ceased to exist. They vanished as though they had never been real, as though they had been some kind of nightmare that we had all shared collectively. When the light returned, when the solar storm passed and the normal patterns of illumination resumed, the shadows came back. But they were different. They were less active. They seemed almost dormant, as though the week of absolute darkness had drained them of their energy or their will to attack. Over the following weeks, the shadow attacks became less frequent and less severe. By the end of the summer, they had stopped almost entirely. People were able to resume their lives, though nobody in Fort Yukon was ever quite the same. We all bore psychological scars from that experience. We all carried with us the memory of being hunted by something that should not have existed. The scientific community eventually offered an explanation for what had happened. They suggested that the unusual electromagnetic activity from the solar storm, combined with some kind of mass psychological phenomenon, might have created a temporary dissociative state in the population of Fort Yukon. They suggested that we had all experienced a shared hallucination or delusion, and that the deaths that had occurred during that week were either suicides triggered by the psychological stress or accidents that had been misinterpreted in the context of the mass hysteria. But I know that it's not what happened. I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. And I know that for 1 week, something that should not exist became real in Fort Yukon. Something connected to shadow and darkness and the spaces between light. Something that fed on human fear and human flesh. I left Fort Yukon shortly after the plague ended. I couldn't bear to stay in a place where such things could happen. I moved to Fairbanks, and eventually I made my way to the lower 48 states, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that nightmare. But the fear never left me. Every time I see my shadow, I remember what happened. Every time the light changes and my shadow shifts, I feel a moment of terror. I have spent 62 years waiting for it to happen again, waiting for the shadows to rise up and become active once more. I have spent 62 years looking over my shoulder, always afraid that the darkness will come back. And I have come to understand something terrifying that I wish I didn't to understand. The solar storm in 1961 didn't to destroy the shadows. It just put them to sleep. It paused them temporarily. And as I have watched the years pass, as I have followed the patterns of solar activity and magnetic storms, I have realized something that fills me with dread. The conditions that created the absolute darkness that ended the plague, the specific patterns of solar activity and atmospheric disruption, they are going to happen again. Scientists predict that a solar storm of similar magnitude will occur within the next few years, maybe within the next few months. And when that happens, when there is a week of complete darkness followed by the return of light, I believe the shadows will wake up again. I believe they will be hungry after their long sleep. I believe they will rise up and attack once more, not just in Fort Yukon but everywhere, in every place where light can cast shadows. The most terrifying realization of all is understanding that there is nowhere to hide. Darkness is everywhere when the sun is blocked. Light is everywhere when the sun returns. And caught between those two extremes, we are eternally vulnerable to the shadows that we cannot escape, the darkness that follows us everywhere, the fear that lives in the spaces between illumination and blackness. My final question for you is this: if you knew that your own shadow could become a weapon against you, that darkness itself could become hostile and alive, would you spend your life avoiding shadows, or would you accept that some things in nature are beyond our understanding and beyond our control? Tell me in the comments what you would do. Story 4. Stone Circle, a confession from the North Slope. I lost 6 months of my life inside those stones. 6 months that I can to account for. 6 months that everyone else experiences 3 days. That is what I'm trying to tell you now, before my mind completely fractures under the weight of what I know, before the thing I saw in the Northern Lights comes back for me. My name is Dr. James Morrison. I am a geological surveyor and anthropologist. I spent 20 years studying ancient sites across Alaska, looking for archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian settlements. I am not a supernatural researcher. I don't believe in ghosts or curses. I believe in stone and soil, in carbon dating and empirical evidence. But the Inupiat Stone Circle destroyed every rational belief I've ever held. The circle was discovered in late August on the North Slope of Alaska, about 200 miles north of Barrow, in some of the most remote and desolate tundra in North America. A petroleum geologist named Sandra Reeves found it while conducting exploratory surveys for an oil company. She described it as a perfect ring of ancient stones, maybe 60 feet in diameter, each stone standing about 8 feet tall. The stones were covered in markings that Sandra initially thought were just natural erosion patterns. But when she examined them more closely, she realized they were deliberate. They were carvings. They were a language. They were something designed to communicate a message to anyone who found them. Sandra contacted the University of Alaska, and I was brought in as a specialist to examine the site. I arrived at the North Slope Research Station on September 3rd. The weather was already turning cold, the sun staying lower on the horizon each day as autumn pushed toward winter. Sandra picked me up at the landing strip and drove me out to the stone circle in a vehicle that bounced and rattled across the frozen tundra. When I first saw the circle, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something unsettling about it, something eerie about those massive stones arranged in such a perfect geometric pattern in the middle of endless, empty tundra. The stones were dark granite, worn smooth by thousands of years of wind and weather. But the markings on them were still distinct, still visible, still carrying some kind of message that I couldn't quite comprehend. I spent the first day photographing and documenting the stones. I took rubbings of the carved surfaces. I collected samples of the granite. I measured the diameter and height of the circle. Everything about the formation was unusual. The stones predated any known Inupiat settlements in the region by centuries, maybe millennia. The carving style didn't match anything in the archaeological record. The geometric precision was impossible for tools available in the pre-contact era. Everything about this circle suggested something ancient, something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged conventional understanding of human history. But it was the markings that truly disturbed me. The carvings on each stone seemed to follow a pattern, a sequence that repeated and evolved as I moved around the circle. Some of the markings looked almost like runes. Others resembled star charts or astronomical diagrams. And scattered throughout the carvings were symbols that I couldn't identify, symbols that seemed to represent something between language and mathematics, something that existed in a category I never encountered before. Sandra asked if I wanted to spend the night at the site. She said the research station was willing to have someone monitor the circle overnight to document any natural phenomena that might affect the stones. I told her I would do it. I said it as a scientist. I said it as someone who wanted to gather more data. I said it without understanding what I was agreeing to. That night, as the sun sank below the horizon for the first time in weeks, I was alone with the stones. I set up my equipment inside the circle. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, temperature monitors, and a sophisticated camera system set to take photographs at regular intervals. I had a radio connection to the research station in case of emergency. I told myself I was completely safe. I told myself I was just spending a night in an isolated location, documenting an interesting archaeological site. I told myself that nothing bad could possibly happen. I was catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. The first thing I noticed was how the darkness changed as night fell. Normally, at this latitude in September, twilight persists for hours. But inside the stone circle, the darkness came suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. Outside the circle, the sky retained a pale blue glow from the distant sun. But inside the stones, night was absolute and complete. I turned on my camp lights and tried to continue my documentation work. I was photographing the northern face of each stone when I heard the first sound. A low vibration, almost below the threshold of hearing, like the earth itself was humming. I checked my audio equipment. The vibration registered clearly on my instruments. It was real. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The sound gradually increased in intensity. It developed texture, complexity. It began to sound less like a natural vibration and more like something deliberate. More like a voice. More like chanting. It was the most unsettling, eerie sound I ever encountered. It was layered and ancient and achingly, profoundly alien. It was music and language and something else entirely. Something that made every part of my brain scream that what I was hearing didn't belong to any known human culture. I tried to contact the research station on my radio. The signal was dead. No response. No static. Just absolute silence. I felt panic rising in my chest. I told myself the radio had malfunctioned. I told myself I'd done something wrong with the equipment. I told myself everything was fine. Then the sky changed. The northern lights erupted into existence with a violence I never witnessed before. The aurora borealis is normally a gentle phenomenon, dancing sheets of green and purple light moving gradually across the sky. But these lights were different. They were violent and chaotic, moving with impossible speed, forming shapes and patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. The auroras were painting pictures in the sky. I could see them clearly. Images and symbols, sequences of illuminated patterns that matched the carvings on the stones around me. The lights were showing me the meaning of the stones. The lights were communicating something ancient and terrifying and utterly essential. And I realized with crushing horror that I could read them. I could understand what the lights were showing me. They were displaying the future. They were showing me visions of events that hadn't happened yet. They were painting pictures of my death. I saw myself getting older, decades passing in moments. I saw my hands becoming wrinkled and fragile. I saw myself alone in a room I didn't recognize, crying with a despair so profound it was suffocating. I saw myself reaching towards something I couldn't grasp. I saw the moment of my death, saw it in terrible detail, saw exactly how and when my life would end. And the most horrifying part was that the sequence of events made sense. The visions weren't too abstract or symbolic. They were literal. They were showing me my specific future death, an event that hadn't happened yet but was somehow predetermined, painted in light in the aurora above the stone circle. I tried to run. I tried to escape the circle, to break free from whatever nightmare was unfolding. But when I moved toward the edge of the stones, something stopped me. It wasn't a physical barrier. It was something else, a resistance, a pressure, a force that pushed back against my movement. It was like running through water, like the air itself had become viscous and resistant. I collapsed back to the ground inside the circle. The chanting grew louder. The auroras continued their terrible dance. And I realized with absolute certainty that time was distorting. Minutes were stretching into hours, or hours were compressing into minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. My sense of duration had completely fractured. The light show continued for what felt like an eternity. The visions in the aurora kept flowing, showing me more glimpses of my future, more moments of horror and despair, more details of the specific circumstances surrounding my death. The more I saw, the more certain I became that these weren't predictions. These were promises. These were certainties. Somehow, the stones and the aurora and the primordial chanting were showing me fixed points in my future that I could not escape. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The aurora vanished. The chanting ceased. The pressure that had trapped me inside the circle released. The sky returned to normal. And I found myself sitting on the frozen ground, shaking and gasping, my mind fractured by what I experienced. I looked at my watch. The date had changed. It was now September 7th. My camp lights were nearly drained of power. The batteries in my digital watch had been consumed at a rate that should have been impossible. I had maybe 15 minutes of battery life left before everything would go dark. I stumbled out of the circle and activated my emergency beacon. The research station picked me up within an hour. When Sandra arrived to collect me, she was completely shocked. She said I'd only been missing for 3 days. I told her I'd been inside the circle for 6 months. I told her about the visions in the aurora. I told her about the chanting. I told her about seeing my death painted in light above the stones. Sandra didn't believe me. She said I suffered some kind of psychological episode brought on by isolation and stress. She said I'd been out there for exactly 3 days because that is what the equipment log showed. That is what my missing time aligned with. 3 days, not 6 months, 3 days. But I know what I experienced. I know how long I spent inside those stones. And I know with absolute certainty that the visions in the aurora were real and true. I left Alaska immediately. I resigned from my position at the university. I refused to discuss the stone circle with anyone. I wanted to forget about it, to pretend it never happened, to convince myself that the temporal distortion was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But I've been researching what the Iñupiat people actually know about the stone circle. And I found something terrifying in the historical records. The Iñupiat have legends about the circle. According to their oral histories, which were documented by anthropologists in the 1960s, the stones are a prison. They were built by shamans in ancient times to contain something dangerous. Something that existed before humanity arrived in Alaska. Something that the shamans trapped beneath the ground using rituals and stones carved with protective runes. According to the legends, if anyone spends the night inside the circle, they become aware of the thing beneath the ground. They see visions of the future. They experience temporal distortion. And most crucially, they become marked by whatever entity is imprisoned there. They become targets. They become prey. The Inupiat legends say that people who see the visions in the aurora have been marked for death by the thing in the ground. They have limited time left to live, and the thing that imprisoned beneath the stones will claim them when their marked time expires. I found records of 7 researchers who spent nights at the stone circle over the past 40 years. 7 people who saw the auroras. 7 people who experienced the temporal distortion and the visions of their own deaths. 6 of them are dead. All 6 died in the exact manner they saw in the auroras. All 6 experienced their predicted deaths with horrifying precision. All 6 had their deaths fulfilled exactly as the northern lights had shown them. There is one more person on that list. Someone else who experienced the visions and lived beyond their initial encounter with the stones. Someone else who is still alive. That person is me. I don't know how much time I have left. The visions didn't give me a specific date for my death. They just showed me the circumstances. They showed me the location. They showed me the moment of my passing. But they didn't show me when. I could have years left. I could have months. I could have weeks. The uncertainty is slowly destroying me. I am looking for signs that my marked time is running out. I am interpreting every illness, every accident, every unusual event as a possible indicator that my death is approaching. I am paranoid. I am fractured. I am barely holding on to sanity. But I need to tell someone what happened. I need someone to know that the Inupiat Stone Circle ISN is just an archaeological curiosity. It's something far older and more terrifying. It is a prison holding something ancient and hostile. It is a trap for anyone curious enough or foolish enough to spend a night inside its borders. It is a thing that marks people for death and fulfills those marks with supernatural precision. The most terrifying part of my experience is this. I don't think the thing imprisoned beneath the stones is evil. I think it is simply trying to communicate. I think the chanting and the auroras and the visions are its way of reaching out to the world above, trying to make contact with humanity, trying to tell us something essential about our own futures. The shamans built those stones to contain it, to keep it imprisoned, to prevent it from seeing the surface world. But the barrier is weakening. The stones are ancient. They wearing down. And each person who spends a night inside the circle accelerates the degradation of the barrier. Each researcher who experiences the visions is feeding information to the imprisoned entity about our modern world. I think eventually, the stones will fail completely. I think the barrier will break. And I think when that happens, the thing beneath the ground will finally emerge. And all of us who saw the visions will already be dead, unable to warn anyone or explain what is coming. I'm telling this story now because I might not have much time left. I'm telling it because someone needs to know the truth. And I'm telling it because I want someone to understand what happened to me, why I changed, why I became paranoid and fractured, why I see signs of my approaching death in every shadow and every unexpected sound. The worst part is that the visions keep replaying in my mind. The aurora is still showing me images I can unsee. The chanting still echoes in my ears. The temporal distortion has left me unable to trust my own perception of time. Do you know how long I've been living in this fractured state? Days feel like hours. Hours feel like days. I am losing my grip on reality, and I know it. Just because I saw something I was never meant to see. I looked into the mind of the thing beneath the stones, and it marked me for death. So I am asking you this. If you encountered something ancient and terrifying that showed you your own death with absolute certainty, if you knew with complete surety that your end was predetermined and unavoidable, would you want to know? Would you want to see the specific circumstances of your death? Or would you rather die in ignorance, unaware of what is coming? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you have the courage to spend a night inside the stone circle. Tell me if you think I am still human, or if I have been transformed into something else by what I experienced beneath the northern lights. Story 5. Thing in the ice. Russia. A secret 1946 expedition. I found the declassified Soviet documents in a box of my grandfather's belongings after he died, and the last entry made my blood turn to ice. Day 12. We have breached through 30 meters of permafrost. There is a city beneath us. It should not exist. The structures are impossibly old. We can see moving shadows inside the ice. They are moving toward us. The question I am asking you to answer in the comments is this. If you discovered evidence of something ancient and terrifying hidden beneath the frozen ground for thousands of years, something that governments have actively tried to keep secret, Would you expose it or would you leave it buried where it belongs? My name is Thomas Volkov, and I am 56 years old. I am the grandson of Colonel Dmitry Volkov, a Soviet military officer who led an expedition to Alaska in 1946, just as the Cold War was beginning to take shape. My grandfather rarely spoke about that expedition. When I was young, I remember him having terrible nightmares. I remember him waking up screaming about things moving in the darkness. I remember him refusing to go into cold rooms, always insisting that the temperature stay above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the bitter Russian winters. He died when I was 32 years old, never fully explaining what had happened to him in Alaska all those decades earlier. I inherited his personal effects, mostly just old photographs and a few journals. But there was one box that had been sealed with tape and labeled in my grandfather's handwriting with a single word: forbidden. For years, I left that box unopened. I wasn't too sure why. Some part of me seemed to understand that opening it would expose me to something I didn't want to know about. But after my grandfather's death, after years of living with unanswered questions, I finally broke the seal and looked inside. What I found was a collection of documents, most of them written in Russian military code, along with several photographs that were so disturbing and so utterly unexplainable that I initially thought they must be some kind of elaborate hoax or artistic project. But the more I examined them, the more I became certain that they were authentic, that they were real, and that they contained evidence of something that had happened in Alaska in 1946 that had been deliberately covered up by both the Soviet and American governments. The documents told the story of an expedition, a secret Soviet military mission to northern Alaska, ostensibly to conduct geological surveys and mineral assessments in the remote Arctic territory. But as I read through my grandfather's notes, it became clear that the expedition had discovered something far more significant and far more terrifying than simple geological features. On day 3 of the expedition, my grandfather had written about unusual geological formations, structures that didn't match any known natural phenomena, regular geometric shapes beneath the permafrost, what appeared to be carved symbols in the ice. The team had been intrigued. They had begun to drill deeper, using equipment that was state-of-the-art for 1946. By day 7, the tone of my grandfather's notes had changed. He wrote about finding what appeared to be metal objects in the ice, corroded and ancient, but unmistakably artificial. Objects that suggested intelligent design. Objects that could not have been made by any known human civilization. The team had continued drilling. Despite growing unease, despite the eerie and unsettling feeling that something was wrong about this place, they had continued downward. On day 10, my grandfather wrote about breaking through a massive ice shelf and discovering what lay beneath. His handwriting became less controlled, more frantic, as he described what the team had found. There was a city, not ruins, not fragments, but an actual city, preserved in the ice, structures still standing. Buildings arranged in patterns that suggested urban planning and civilization. My grandfather estimated the city to be hundreds of meters across, possibly larger. He wrote that the architecture was impossible. The angles were wrong. The materials were wrong. Everything about the city suggested that it had been built by a civilization that was not human. Most disturbing were the photographs. I examined them with a magnifying glass, trying to understand what I was looking at. The images showed what appeared to be frozen structures visible through the ice. Geometric shapes, towers, what might have been streets or pathways. But there was something else in the photographs. Something that made my skin crawl and my heart race with primal fear. In several of the photographs, visible through the translucent ice, there appeared to be shadows. Shapes that seemed to move through the frozen structures. My grandfather had noted in his journal that the team had observed movement. Movement inside the ice. Movement of things that should not be moving because they should have been dead or frozen for thousands of years. On day 11, my grandfather wrote that contact with the main camp was becoming difficult. The equipment was malfunctioning. Radio signals were degrading. The team members were becoming increasingly paranoid and frightened. One of the men had refused to continue the drilling and had attempted to leave the site. He had been stopped by the military personnel accompanying the expedition. My grandfather noted that the man had been sedated and was now unconscious. And then came day 12, the final entry, the one that would explain everything about my grandfather, his nightmares and his psychological deterioration over the following decades. We've broken through into an interior chamber. The drilling equipment has penetrated the outer shell of one of the structures. We've lowered a camera into the chamber. What we see is impossible. The chamber is not filled with ice. It is filled with a liquid of some kind. Viscous, dark, the camera is showing movement in the liquid. Large shapes, moving with purpose, moving toward the drill shaft. They are aware of the opening we have created. They are moving toward it. Moving toward us. We are sealing the borehole immediately. We are abandoning the site. Recommend immediate military quarantine of the region. Do not let anyone approach this area. Do not allow further drilling. There is something down there, something that has been preserved in the ice for a very long time. And we have just woken it up. That was the final entry. After that, my grandfather, this journal went silent. I spent weeks researching what I could find about Soviet military operations in Alaska in 1946. Most of the information was still classified, but I was able to piece together fragments of the story. The expedition had indeed taken place. The site had been abandoned hastily. Within months, the area had been declared a restricted military zone. No one was allowed to approach it. The American government had been informed of the discovery, and there had been agreements between the two superpowers to keep the site closed and undisturbed. During the Cold War, the restricted zone had been maintained by both American and Soviet military forces, with an understanding that neither side would attempt to investigate further what lay beneath the ice. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the agreement had continued. The site remained restricted, now under American military control, with explicit instructions that no civilian was to approach it under any circumstances. I became obsessed with understanding what my grandfather and his team had discovered. I began to reach out to other researchers, other people who were interested in anomalous archaeological findings and classified military operations. That is when I connected with a man named Professor Eric Strand, a retired geologist who had spent his career studying unusual geological formations in the Arctic. Professor Strand was fascinated by my grandfather's documents. He believed that what the team had discovered was real. He believed that there was an ancient structure beneath the Alaskan permafrost, and he had a theory about what it might be. He told me that there have been scientific reports for decades of anomalous electromagnetic readings in certain areas of the Arctic. He said that some researchers believe these readings could be consistent with ancient technology or artificial structures. He said that his own research had suggested that there might be something beneath the ice in northern Alaska, something that was so old that it predated modern human civilization by thousands of years. But Professor Strand also warned me about something. He said that there were powerful forces that wanted this information to remain buried. He said that governments, both American and Russian, had invested enormous resources into keeping the site sealed. He said that if I began asking too many questions, if I began trying to publicize what I had found, there would be consequences. I didn't heed his warning. I began to write articles about my grandfather's expedition. I posted the documents online. I gave interviews to anyone who would listen. I tried to alert the world to the fact that something ancient and terrifying was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost, something that our governments were actively trying to keep secret. And then the visits started. At first, they were subtle. I would come home to find that my apartment had been searched, but nothing appeared to be taken. I received calls in the middle of the night where someone would breathe heavily on the line and then hang up. I was followed on the street by people in unmarked cars. My email accounts were hacked. My bank accounts were frozen temporarily without explanation. Then one night, 2 men in dark suits came to my door. They showed me identification that indicated they worked for a government agency that I had never heard of before. They told me that I needed to stop what I was doing. They told me that the documents I possessed were classified by the Soviet government, and that I was in violation of international law by possessing and distributing them. They told me that I had 48 hours to remove all information about the expedition from the internet and to stop giving interviews about the subject. I refused. That is when they told me something that made me understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. They told me that the restricted zone in Alaska was not just a military research facility. They told me that teams of scientists were regularly sent to the site to monitor what was happening beneath the ice. They told me that over the past 70 years, those monitoring teams had documented significant changes in the structure beneath the permafrost. They told me that whatever my grandfather's team had awakened when they drilled into that preserved city, it was active. It was moving. It was doing something beneath the ice. And then they told me the most terrifying thing of all. The permafrost in that region of Alaska has been melting at an accelerating rate due to climate change. The ice that had preserved whatever lies beneath it for thousands of years is gradually disappearing. Within 50 years, maybe less, the structure beneath the ice will be completely exposed. And when that happens, when that thing is no longer buried, when it can finally emerge from its frozen tomb. No one knows what is going to happen. The two men told me that I needed to understand the gravity of this situation. They told me that the governments of the world had made a conscious decision to keep this information secret, not out of malice, but out of necessity. They told me that the public was not ready to know what was buried in the ice. They told me that if the truth became widely known, if people began to understand what was coming as the ice melted, there would be mass panic, social breakdown, and chaos. They told me that I needed to delete everything I had posted online, destroy all the documents I had gathered, and never speak about any of this again. I told them I wouldn't. Within weeks, I began to notice changes in my health. Strange rashes appeared on my skin. I developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. I experienced symptoms of something that felt like poisoning. I went to doctors and they couldn't find anything wrong with me, but I knew what was happening. I was being slowly, methodically poisoned by forces that I couldn't see or touch or fight against. And that is when I realized the terrible truth about what my grandfather had experienced all those decades ago. He hadn't just discovered the thing in the ice. He had been exposed to it in some way. He had been infected by it, or contaminated by it, or somehow marked by contact with it. And for the rest of his life, his body had been fighting against something that was slowly destroying him from the inside out. I went back and reread his journals with new understanding. His descriptions of nightmares, his paranoia, his need to stay warm, his obsessive checking of his own body for signs of contamination. These weren't just psychological symptoms. These were symptoms of someone who had been exposed to something alien, something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. I made the decision to go to Alaska, to see the site for myself, to try to understand what my grandfather had discovered and what was still happening beneath that ice. It took months of planning and careful maneuvering, but I managed to get close to the restricted zone. I flew to Fairbanks and rented a car. I drove north through increasingly remote territory until I could go no further by road. Then I hiked. The restricted zone is marked by military fencing and warning signs, but security in that remote area is surprisingly light. I was able to slip past the perimeter without being immediately detected. What I found was both less and more than I expected. The site itself is nothing visually spectacular. It is just a section of frozen ground, marked by equipment and monitoring stations. But underneath, through my grandfather's photographs and through my own research, I could see what was really there. I could see the outline of the preserved city in the ice. I could see the structures that shouldn't exist. And I could see evidence of movement, subtle changes in the arrangement of the ice, patterns that suggested something living was still moving beneath the surface. I spent hours at the site, documenting everything, taking photographs, collecting samples of ice and soil. And that, when I felt it, a presence, something aware of me, something watching, something that knew I was there, standing above its frozen tomb. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. I felt fear that went beyond rational comprehension. I understood, in that moment, what my grandfather had experienced. I understood what it meant to feel the attention of something ancient and alien focused directly on you. I ran. I left the site and hiked back to my car and drove away as fast as I could. Within days, I became violently ill. The symptoms I had been experiencing worsened dramatically. My body developed fever and chills. My skin broke out in strange patterns. I could barely keep food down. I knew that I was dying, that I had been infected or contaminated by my proximity to the thing beneath the ice, that I had days, maybe weeks left to live. So I am telling you this story now. I am publishing what I know while I still have the strength and clarity of mind to do so. I am sharing my grandfather's documents with you. I am telling you the truth about what lies beneath the Alaskan permafrost. And I am warning you about what is coming. The ice is melting. Every year, the permafrost is thawing at an accelerating rate. The structures beneath that ice are becoming more exposed. The thing that has been sleeping in the darkness for thousands of years is beginning to wake up. And when the ice is finally gone, when whatever is beneath it can finally emerge, I genuinely dawn to know what is going to happen to our world. Governments are preparing for it. Military forces around the world are being positioned. Scientists are quietly conducting research, trying to understand what they are about to encounter. But the public remains in the dark, kept in ignorance for their own supposed protection. I don't think that is right. I think people deserve to know the truth about what is coming. I think people deserve to have some understanding of the danger that is slowly being revealed by a warming climate and melting ice. My grandfather died without ever fully revealing what he had discovered. He carried that burden for his entire life. And I believe it was the weight of that secret that ultimately destroyed him. I'm not going to make the same mistake. I'm going to tell you what I know, even though it terrifies me, even though it is making me sick, even though there are forces that desperately want me to stay silent. The thing in the ice is real. It has been there for thousands of years. And it is waking up. My final question for you is this. If you knew that something ancient and terrifying was about to be released into the world through no fault of our own, something that we didn't create and that we might not be able to control, would you want to know about it in advance so you could prepare, or would you prefer to live in blissful ignorance until it was too late? Tell me in the comments what you would choose. Story 6. Congregation of Winter. Have you ever wondered what could drive an entire village to peel the skin from their own bodies as an offering to something they called the true lord of the land? I am a historian specializing in Alaskan frontier settlements, and what I discovered in the ruins of a forgotten 19th century village will haunt me until the day I die. My name is Dr. Michael Brennan, and last October I was part of an archaeological expedition to a remote site in the Alaska Range, about 200 miles northwest of Fairbanks. We received reports from a bush pilot about unusual structures visible from the air, a cluster of buildings in an area where no settlement should exist according to historical records. The location was so isolated that it took us 4 days of hiking through brutal terrain just to reach it. And what we found there was so disturbing, so utterly terrifying, that the site was immediately sealed by federal authorities and erased from all public records. The village sat in a narrow valley surrounded by jagged peaks, a place where winter reigns for 9 months of the year and summer is just a brief, pale memory. 15 buildings in various states of decay, arranged in a perfect circle around what looked like a church or meeting hall. The architecture was wrong for the period. Angles that didn't make sense. Roof lines that seemed to defy gravity. As if whoever built these structures was following blueprints designed for a different kind of reality. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind, no sound at all except our own breathing and footsteps. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on us, watching our every move. The temperature was well below freezing even though it was only early October, and frost covered everything in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. We entered the central building first, the one we thought might be a church. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly open, as if inviting us inside. The interior was a single large room with wooden pews facing a raised platform where you expect to find an altar. But instead of a cross or religious symbols, there was something else. A crude statue carved from ice, still solid after God knows how many decades, depicting a figure that was tall and impossibly thin, with arms that reached down to the floor and a face that had no features except a gaping mouth. The walls were covered in journals and papers, nailed directly to the wood. Hundreds of pages of cramped handwriting that told a story of horror and madness that I can barely bring myself to repeat. The settlers had come here in 1873, a group of religious separatists fleeing persecution, seeking isolation where they could practice their faith without interference. What they found instead was something that changed their faith entirely, something that showed them a new God to worship. The journals described the first winter in disturbing detail. The cold was beyond anything they experienced, beyond anything natural. It had a presence, a weight, an intelligence that seemed to recognize them, to study them. People started hearing voices in the wind, whispers that promised warmth and salvation if they would only submit, if they would only pledge themselves completely to what they called the endless winter, the true lord of this frozen land. By the second winter, the entire village had converted. They stopped heating their homes, stopped wearing protective clothing, stopped following any of the survival practices that kept people alive in the Arctic. Instead, they embraced the cold, let it into their bodies, let it change them from the inside out. The journals described a euphoria, a religious ecstasy that came from freezing, from feeling the ice form in their veins and their breath crystallize in their lungs. But the worst part, the part that made my hands shake as I read, came in the final entries. The cold demanded a sacrifice, a demonstration of absolute devotion. The villagers had to prove they belonged to winter completely, that there was no part of them that resisted, no boundary between their flesh and the frozen world around them. So they removed their skin. Every single person in the village, men, women, even children, had systematically peeled away their own skin as an offering, as a way of showing that the barrier between their bodies and the cold was no longer necessary. The journal entries became increasingly difficult to read after that point, the handwriting shaky and unclear, the words often trailing off into nonsense or patterns that looked like the frost designs I'd seen outside. But the final entry, written by someone identified only as Brother Matthias, was crystal clear and absolutely chilling. It described the transformation, how removing the skin had allowed the cold to enter completely, how they could finally hear the true voice of their God speaking directly through their exposed nerves and muscles. It spoke of a promise, a covenant that bound them to this place forever, as guardians and worshippers, as living extensions of the winter itself. I should have left after reading those journals. I should have documented what we found and gotten out immediately. But my team wanted to search the other buildings, to gather more evidence, to understand the full scope of what had happened here. So we split up, each taking a different structure, planning to meet back at the central building in an hour. I chose one of the smaller houses, a cabin on the eastern edge of the circle. The door was frozen shut, and I had to use my shoulder to force it open. The interior was dark, the windows covered with frost so thick it blocked out all light. I turned on my flashlight and immediately wished I hadn't. The floor was covered in skin, sheets of it, carefully preserved by the cold, arranged in neat piles like folded laundry. Human skin with the hair still attached, with fingernails and toenails still connected, like empty costumes waiting for their owners to return. And in the corner of the room, sitting in a rocking chair, was one of those owners. A figure that had once been human, sitting perfectly still, its skinless body frozen solid, its exposed muscles and tendons covered in a layer of frost that sparkled in my flashlight beam. Its eyes were open, staring at me with an awareness that should have been impossible, and as I watched in horror, I saw its chest move. Just slightly, just enough to prove that whatever it wasn't quite dead. I ran. I burst out of that cabin and sprinted toward the central building, screaming for my team, no longer caring about scientific documentation or archaeological protocols. I just needed to get away from that thing, from the knowledge that the villagers hadn't died, that they were still here, still conscious, still aware after 150 years of frozen existence. My team was already gathering when I reached the meeting hall, their faces pale with fear, their hands shaking. They all found similar things in the other buildings. More skinless figures sitting in chairs, lying in beds, kneeling in prayer, all frozen but somehow alive, all watching with those terrible aware eyes. And the worst part was realizing that the buildings were arranged to form a pattern, that if you looked at the village from above, the structures spelled out words in that same strange script we'd seen in the frost patterns. Words that roughly translated to, "We are the congregation. We wait for the faithful. Join us in worship." That is when the temperature started dropping. Not gradually, but suddenly, plummeting from below freezing to something far colder. Something that made the air itself seem to crystallize. Our breath froze before it could leave our mouths. Ice formed on our eyelashes and beards. The pain in our exposed skin was immediate and overwhelming, like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. And then we heard them. Footsteps, slow and shuffling, coming from every direction, converging on the central building. The skinless villagers were moving, leaving their positions in the outer buildings, coming to greet us, to welcome us to their congregation. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see their silhouettes, tall and wrong, moving with jerky, unnatural motions, their exposed muscles working in ways that should have been impossible. We barricaded the door, piling pews and furniture against it, knowing it wouldn't hold for long but needing to buy time. The scratching started immediately, fingernails on wood, dozens of them working in unison, scraping away at the barrier between us and them. And underneath the scratching was something worse. Singing, a hymn in a language I didn't recognize, voices that shouldn't be able to make sound without lips or tongues, harmonizing in patterns that hurt to hear. I found an emergency radio in my pack and called for extraction, screaming into the receiver about what we found, begging for immediate evacuation. The response came back garbled and unclear, but I caught enough words to understand. Help was coming. We just had to survive for 6 hours until a helicopter could reach us. 6 hours in that nightmare. 6 hours listening to those things circle the building, singing their horrible hymns, scratching at the walls and door. 6 hours watching the temperature drop lower and lower, watching frost form on the inside of our clothing, feeling the cold seep into our bones despite our best efforts to stay warm. 6 hours wondering if we'd end up like them, if whatever had transformed the original settlers was contagious, if we'd already been exposed just by being here. The skinless villagers never broke through. They didn't need to. Around the 4th hour, one of my team members, Dr. Sarah Vance, started acting strangely. She kept talking about how beautiful the cold was, how peaceful it felt, how she could hear voices promising her warmth if she would just step outside and join them. We had to physically restrain her, had to watch her eyes as something changed in them, as she stopped being entirely human and started becoming something else. The helicopter arrived just after dawn, but it was almost too late. Sarah had broken free and was trying to remove her own clothing, trying to expose herself to the killing cold, muttering about devotion and sacrifice in the true Lord of Winter. We dragged her to the helicopter by force, our hands numb, our bodies pushed to the absolute limit of what flesh and blood can endure. The authorities quarantined us for 2 weeks, running every medical test imaginable, trying to determine if we'd been infected with some kind of pathogen or parasite. They found nothing. Whatever had transformed the villagers, whatever had kept them alive and conscious in their skinless state for over a century, it didn't show up on any test our modern medicine could devise. Sarah recovered, mostly, though she still gets a distant look in her eyes sometimes when the temperature drops, and I caught her scratching at her arms as if testing how easily the skin might come away. The site was officially destroyed a month later. They burned everything, then buried the ashes under tons of concrete and posted armed guards to make sure nobody ever went back. The journals were confiscated and classified. Our findings were sealed under national security protocols. The official story is that we found evidence of a tragic frontier disaster, starvation and exposure. Nothing more. But I know the truth. I know those things are still out there, buried under concrete but not dead, never dead, still conscious and waiting in their frozen prison. And I know that what they worshipped, what they called the true Lord of this land, is real. I felt its presence, heard its whispers, understood the terrible allure of surrendering to the cold completely, of shedding the weak barrier of skin and letting winter claim every part of you. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, I can still hear the singing. Faint and distant but unmistakable, that same hymn in that same impossible language, carried on the wind from hundreds of miles away. And I wonder if the concrete will hold, if the barriers they built are strong enough to contain something that existed long before humans came to Alaska and will exist long after we're gone. I wonder if more people will hear the call, will feel that same religious ecstasy that drove an entire village to skin themselves alive. I wonder if the congregation is still recruiting, still waiting for the faithful to join them in their worship of the endless winter. The scars on my hands from frostbite have never fully healed. On cold days they ache with a pain that goes deeper than nerve damage, deeper than tissue death. It's like the cold left something behind, a mark that connects me to that place, to those things, to the frozen God they serve. And some nights I wake up scratching at my arms, testing the skin, wondering how difficult it would really be to peel it away, wondering if the promise of warmth and belonging might actually be real. So here is my question for you. If you heard voices in the winter wind promising you peace and warmth and belonging, promising to free you from the pain and isolation of being human, would you have the strength to resist? Or would you find yourself drawn to that frozen congregation, ready to shed your skin and join their eternal worship? Write your answer in the comments, because I need to know if I'm the only one who still hears them calling, or if others have felt that terrible pull toward the cold. Story 7. Glowing herd. What happens when nuclear radiation doesn't to kill something, but changes it into something that hunts? I am a wildlife biologist for the Department of Energy, and my job is to monitor the long-term environmental impact of nuclear testing sites across America. They walked through irradiated deserts, collected samples from contaminated lakes, documented mutations in insects and plants. But nothing in my training prepared me for what I found on Amchitka Island in the Aleutians, or for the terrifying truth about what nuclear testing created in that isolated, frozen wilderness. This isn't a story about radiation sickness or environmental disaster. This is about something far more horrifying, something that glows in the darkness, something that hunts in perfect coordination, something that shouldn't exist but does, and it is spreading beyond the island where it was born. Amchitka Island is one of America's darkest secrets. Between 1965 and 1971, the government detonated 3 underground nuclear bombs there, testing weapons during the height of the Cold War. The official reports say the tests were safe, contained, that any environmental damage was minimal and localized. They were lying. I know because I've seen what those tests created, and I'm terrified of what it might become. I arrived on Amchitka 3 months ago as part of a routine survey team. The island is abandoned now, nothing but wind-scoured rock and tundra, accessible only by helicopter or rough boat ride through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. We were there to collect soil samples, check radiation levels, document any unusual biological activity. Standard procedure for nuclear test sites. The first sign that something was wrong came on our second night. I was reviewing data in our temporary research station when I saw lights moving outside. Not flashlights or equipment lights, but a strange greenish-blue glow that pulsed and shifted in the darkness like bioluminescent algae, except this was on land, moving through the tundra with purpose and direction. I grabbed my camera and went outside. The wind hit me like a frozen fist, but I barely noticed because of what I was seeing. A herd of reindeer, maybe 20 or 30 animals, moving across the landscape in perfect unison. But these weren't the normal reindeer. Their antlers were covered in glowing fungi, luminescent growths that cast an eerie light across the snow, pulsing in rhythm like a shared heartbeat. The sight was beautiful and deeply unsettling. The animals moved with unnatural coordination, turning and stopping as one, like they were controlled by a single mind. I studied herd behavior for years, and this was different. This was precise, purposeful, like watching a school of fish or a flock of starbirds, except these were massive mammals moving with the same impossible synchronization. I took dozens of photographs, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, my hands shaking from more than just cold. The herd stopped about 50 yards away, and every single animal turned to face me simultaneously. 30 sets of eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, 30 heads crowned with glowing fungal growths. All of them perfectly still, perfectly aligned, watching me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Then they started walking toward me, slowly, in perfect formation, and the temperature dropped so fast I could feel ice forming in my nostrils with each breath. I ran back inside the research station and locked the door, my heart hammering. Through the window, I watched the herd surround our building, forming a perfect circle, their glowing antlers creating a ring of cold blue light in the darkness. My colleagues thought I was overreacting until they checked the external temperature sensors. The air outside had dropped 30 degrees in less than 2 minutes. The metal walls of our station were covered in frost, ice spreading across the surface in crystalline patterns. The reindeer stood there for an hour, unmoving, before finally dispersing back into the darkness. When we went outside the next morning, we found a perfect circle of dead tundra grass where they stood, frozen and blackened like it had been flash frozen and killed instantly. I reported the incident to my supervisors, but they dismissed it as unusual animal behavior combined with some kind of localized weather phenomenon. They told me the glowing fungi was probably a bioluminescent species feeding on radiation in the environment. Nothing more. They were wrong, dead wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented 17 more encounters with the herd. Each time, they appeared at night, moving with that same disturbing coordination, surrounding our station or following us when we went out for fieldwork. And each time, the temperature dropped dramatically whenever they got close. It wasn't just cold air. It felt like the heat was being pulled out of the environment, sucked away by something hungry. I started researching the nuclear tests, digging through classified documents that had been declassified over the years. What I found made me realize we were dealing with something far more dangerous than glowing reindeer. The underground detonations had cracked open deep caverns beneath the island, caverns that hadn't seen sunlight in millions of years. And in those caverns, there were fungi. Ancient fungi that had been sealed away in the darkness, feeding on minerals and radiation from the Earth's core. The nuclear blasts had exposed these fungi to massive amounts of radiation, and instead of dying, they demutated. They become something new, something that could spread to surface plants and animals, something that changed the biology of anything it infected. The reindeer weren't being covered by the fungi. They were hosting it. The fungal growths had integrated into their nervous systems, connecting them into a hive mind, a collective organism that thought and moved as one. And the most terrifying part was what the fungi did to their metabolism. It reversed it. Instead of generating heat through normal biological processes, the infected animals absorbed heat from their environment, converting thermal energy into something else, something the fungi used to grow and spread. That is why the temperature dropped around them. They were literally draining the heat from the air, from the ground, from any living thing that got too close. And if they surrounded you for too long, they drained the heat from your body too, pulling the warmth out of your cells until you froze from the inside out. I found records of a Russian research team that had visited the island in the 1980s. 3 of their members disappeared during a night expedition. They were found a week later, frozen solid, surrounded by circular patterns of dead vegetation. The official report blamed exposure and hypothermia. But the photos in the classified file showed something else. The bodies had expressions of terror. Their mouths open in silent screams, their skin covered in a thin layer of blue-green frost that looked exactly like the fungal growth on the reindeer antlers. I tried to convince my team to evacuate, but they thought I was being paranoid. They said the reindeer were harmless, that the temperature drops were explainable, that I was letting isolation and darkness affect my judgment. So I made plans to leave on my own, to get off this cursed island before something terrible happened. But the herd had other plans. On my last night before evacuation, they came for us. All of them. Not just 30 reindeer, but hundreds, emerging from the darkness with their glowing antlers creating a sea of cold blue light that surrounded our research station in a perfect circle. The temperature inside our building started dropping immediately, frost spreading across the walls, our breath coming out in thick clouds. The reindeer stood there, motionless, and I realized with horror that they were coordinating, focusing their heat-draining ability on our building. They were trying to freeze us. Not quickly, but slowly, methodically, like they were performing an experiment of their own. My colleagues finally understood. We tried to start the generator to keep warm, but the fuel had already frozen solid. We tried to radio for emergency evacuation, but the batteries were dead, drained of their energy. Everything that could produce heat or store energy was failing, being pulled toward that glowing circle of mutated animals surrounding us in the darkness. We huddled together in the center of the station, wearing every piece of clothing we had, but it wasn't enough. The cold was relentless, invasive, seeping into our bones like liquid nitrogen. I watched frost form on my colleagues' eyebrows and beards, saw their lips turn blue, felt my own fingers going numb despite 3 layers of gloves. That is when I noticed something even more disturbing. The glowing fungi on the reindeer antlers was pulsing faster, brighter, and in that pulsing light, I could see spores. Millions of them, floating through the air like glowing snow, drifting toward our building, seeping through cracks and vents, landing on every surface and beginning to grow. The fungi was spreading, trying to infect us, trying to add us to the hive mind. I don't remember much after that. Hypothermia does strange things to your mind. I remember the sound of a helicopter, the feeling of being lifted, the blessed warmth of a rescue blanket. I woke up in a military hospital in Anchorage with severe frostbite and early-stage fungal infection in my lungs. They treated me with experimental antifungals and kept me in isolation for 6 weeks. 2 of my colleagues didn't make it. They died from hypothermia complicated by aggressive fungal growth that spread through their respiratory systems. The autopsies showed the fungi had integrated into their nervous tissue, beginning the transformation that would have eventually connected them to the hive mind. The island was quarantined. The official story is environmental contamination from the original nuclear tests. But I know the truth. They were not trying to contain radiation. They were trying to contain the herd, trying to prevent the fungi from spreading to the mainland. And they were failing. Last week, there were reports of glowing reindeer seen on the Alaska Peninsula, over 200 miles from Amchitka Island. The temperature in those areas has been dropping inexplicably, and 3 hikers have gone missing, found days later frozen solid with that same blue-green frost covering their skin. The herd is expanding, the fungi is spreading, and whatever nuclear testing created on that island is coming for the rest of us, spreading across Alaska 1 infected animal at a time, building a hive mind that grows larger and more intelligent with each new host it absorbs. I am writing this from a safe house in Seattle, as far from Alaska as I could get while still being able to monitor the situation. But I I'm not sure anywhere is far enough. Because last night, I saw a deer in the park near my apartment. Just a normal urban deer. Except its antlers had a faint blue-green glow that only showed in complete darkness. And when it looked at me, I felt the temperature drop, just slightly, just enough to know that it sees me, that the hive mind knows where I am. So here is my question for you. If something created by human arrogance and nuclear fire is spreading across the world, absorbing everything in its path into a collective mind that thinks and hunts as one, can it be stopped? Or are we just the next species in line to be consumed by something we created but can no longer control? Write your answer in the comments, because I'm terrified we're already too late. Story 8. Permafrost Library. A linguist is descent. I woke up standing in the snow 3 miles from the research station with no memory of leaving my bed. My feet were bleeding. The temperature was minus 40 degrees, and I could still hear the voice calling to me from somewhere out in the darkness, speaking words in a language that shouldn't exist, a language that had been frozen in ice for 40,000 years. My name is Dr. Eleanor Hayes. I am a computational linguist specializing in ancient language reconstruction. I was brought to the Prudhoe Bay Research Facility in northern Alaska to examine something that shouldn't be possible. Something that had already driven 2 other linguists into psychiatric care. Something that the government wanted kept absolutely secret. It started with ice cores. Scientists at the Prudhoe Bay facility had been extracting permafrost samples from deep underground for years, studying ancient climate patterns and prehistoric ecosystems. In December of last year, while extracting a core sample from a depth of 830 feet, they discovered something unusual. The ice contained an unusual acoustic signature. When technicians accidentally exposed the sample to certain frequencies while conducting standard analysis, something terrifying happened. The ice began emitting sound. Coherent, structured sound that resembled human speech. The facility director, Dr. Robert Chen, brought me in as a consultant. He needed someone who could analyze the acoustic patterns, someone who could determine if what they were hearing was genuine linguistic structure or just coincidental noise artifacts. He needed someone with my expertise in reconstructing dead languages from fragmentary data. I arrived at Prudhoe Bay on a brutally cold January morning. The facility was buried under snow, connected to the outside world only by a single gravel road that was often impassable during winter storms. The isolation was immediate and complete. I was told I'd be staying for 2 weeks to conduct my analysis. I stayed for 3 months before everything fell apart. The audio samples were kept in a sealed laboratory on the facility's lowest level. Dr. Chen gave me access immediately. He explained the process. Technicians had carefully warmed different sections of the permafrost core to specific temperatures while exposing them to specific audio frequencies. At certain temperature and frequency combinations, the ice responded. It emitted sound, complex, layered sound that carried all the markers of intentional communication. The first time I heard it, I felt physically sick. The sound was ancient and wrong and utterly chilling. It was like listening to something that had been imprisoned in ice for tens of thousands of years suddenly beginning to speak. The acoustic structure showed clear patterns of repetition and variation, patterns that suggested language. But it was a language unlike anything in the known linguistic record. The phonemes were strange. The tonal variations were unsettling. The overall effect was deeply, profoundly disturbing to the human ear. I began my analysis that night. I started with basic frequency analysis, attempting to break down the audio into individual linguistic units. I made notes. I created transcriptions using phonetic symbols I invented specifically to capture the unusual sounds. The work was consuming. Hours passed without me noticing. The facility's night staff came and went. The sun set beyond the facility's frosted windows. And still I sat in that sealed laboratory, listening to the voice of something that had been speaking from inside the ice. By 2 a.m, I realized something terrifying. The voice wasn't too random. It was structured. It had grammar. It had syntax. It had meaning. I couldn't understand the meaning yet, but the architecture of the language was becoming clear to me. It followed patterns. It had rules. It was intentional communication from an intelligence that predated modern humanity by thousands of years. I should have stopped there. I should have reported my findings and requested time away from the project. But I couldn't. The language was pulling at something deep in my mind, calling to me, demanding to be understood. I felt compelled to keep listening, keep analyzing, keep pushing toward comprehension. Over the following weeks, I made progress. I identified what appeared to be repeated phrases, I found patterns that suggested pronouns and verb forms. I began to develop a provisional grammar for this impossible, ancient language. And the more I understood, the more terrified I became, because the language seemed to be addressing me. The repeated phrases appeared to be directives. The acoustic patterns seemed to be following my brainwave activity, responding to my attention, adapting as I learned to recognize its structures. It was like the voice in the ice was teaching me, like it was deliberately revealing its language to me in increments I could comprehend. My colleagues noticed my behavior changing. I became obsessive about the recordings. I stopped eating regular meals. I stopped maintaining normal sleep schedules. I spent 16, 18, 20 hours per day in that sealed laboratory, listening to the permafrost voice, learning its language, feeling its presence growing stronger in my mind with each passing day. Dr. Chen expressed concern. He asked if I wanted to take a break, go back to Anchorage, rest and recover. I told him I was fine. I told him I was making major breakthroughs. I lied because I couldn't bear to stop. The voice had become essential to me. The thought of leaving, of not hearing it anymore, was unbearable. That is when the sleepwalking started. I woke up in the snow outside the facility with no memory of how I got there. It was 3 a.m. The temperature was dangerously cold. My bare feet were already showing signs of frostbite. The night guard found me wandering aimlessly toward the north, away from the facility, away from civilization, toward the vast emptiness of the Arctic wilderness. Dr. Chen was horrified. He wanted to send me home immediately. He said I was experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. But I knew better. I knew that something was calling me. Something in the permafrost was reaching out through the voice, pulling at my consciousness, trying to draw me toward it. The sleepwalking was intentional. It was communication. It was an invitation. That night, I made the decision to listen to the recordings again. But this time I would listen without trying to analyze. I would listen to understand what the voice actually wanted from me. I spent the entire night in the laboratory with the permafrost audio playing on a loop. And as I listened, images began forming in my mind. Visions, memories that weren't my own. I saw ice. Endless, frozen ice stretching beneath the tundra for thousands of miles. I saw something trapped beneath the ice. Something vast and conscious and utterly alien to human comprehension. I saw it trying to communicate with the surface world, sending signals upward through the permafrost, waiting for someone to finally understand. I saw myself in those visions. I saw my consciousness somehow merging with the thing beneath the ice, my mind becoming a bridge between its ancient existence and the modern world. I saw myself becoming the voice. I saw myself speaking in that ancient language, drawing others to the frozen north, beginning a process of awakening something that had been sleeping beneath the ice since before human civilization existed. I understood then what had happened to the other linguists. The first linguist, Dr. Marcus Webb, had woken up in the snow like I did. But he walked further. He walked into a whiteout storm. He collapsed from hypothermia and been found barely alive 3 miles from the facility. They airlifted him to Anchorage, where he spent 6 months in psychiatric care before they released him. He hasn't spoken since. He sits in a nursing home and stares at walls and occasionally moves his lips as if still listening to the voice. The second linguist, Dr. Jennifer Zhao, had continued the analysis after Webb collapsed. She made even more progress than I had. She actually began to speak the ancient language, to produce sounds that matched the acoustic patterns of the permafrost voice. And then one night, she simply walked out into the tundra and kept walking. They found her body 3 days later, frozen solid, her face turned toward the north, her mouth still shaped as if she was speaking words in that ancient, impossible language. I was becoming like them. I could feel the transformation happening. The voice was becoming clearer. The visions were becoming more vivid. The compulsion to walk north, to find whatever was trapped beneath the ice, to merge my consciousness with it, was growing stronger every day. I knew I had to do something. I knew I had to break free before I ended up like Webb or Zhao. So I made a decision that might have saved my sanity but may have damned everything else. I deleted all the audio files, every recording of the permafrost voice, every sample, every backup copy. I wiped the hard drives. I destroyed the data. I tried to erase the terrifying language that had burrowed into my mind like a parasite. But it was too late. The voice was already inside me. I could hear it even without the recordings. It echoed in my thoughts. It filled my dreams. It whispered to me in that ancient, chilling language, speaking words I was beginning to understand. words that were slowly rewriting the neural pathways in my brain. Dr. Chen had me airlifted out of Prudhoe Bay the next morning. I was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Anchorage where I spent 6 weeks on medication, undergoing therapy, trying to convince doctors that I wasn't experiencing a psychotic break. I told them the voice had been real. I told them the permafrost was trying to communicate. I told them something ancient and terrifying was trapped beneath the ice, trying to pull linguists into the Arctic wilderness, trying to use our minds as bridges to reach the modern world. They didn't believe me. They increased my medication. They adjusted my diagnosis. They eventually released me with instructions to avoid stressful work environments and to maintain regular psychiatric follow-up. But the voice never left. Even now, sitting in my apartment in Seattle, thousands of miles from the permafrost, I can still hear it. It's quieter now, muted by distance and medication. But it is still there. It still speaks to me. It still shows me visions of the vast, conscious thing beneath the Arctic ice, still reaching upward, still trying to establish contact with the surface world. I've been researching what is really happening in the permafrost, and I've found something terrifying in the scientific literature. Climate change is melting the permafrost. The frozen ground that has remained stable for tens of thousands of years is thawing. Scientists estimate that within 50 years, the permafrost will be largely melted. And when that happens, if there really is something conscious trapped beneath the ice, if there really is an ancient intelligence waiting for the world to change, then it will finally be able to escape. The voice is calling to other linguists. I know this because they found online forums where researchers discuss hearing similar sounds in permafrost samples. They found posts from linguists experiencing sleepwalking episodes, experiencing compulsions to travel north, experiencing visions and hearing voices in their minds. Some of them are already heading to Alaska. Some of them are already falling under the influence of the permafrost language. The government knows about this. I am certain of it. The Prudhoe Bay facility is still conducting research on the permafrost cores, still extracting samples from deeper and deeper depths, still listening to the voice beneath the ice. They were not trying to stop the communication. They re-facilitating it. They re-helping whatever is trapped in the permafrost establish clearer contact with the surface world. I believe the thing beneath the ice is communicating with select individuals. It is building a network of linguists, of people whose minds have been touched by its ancient language, people who can serve as bridges between its consciousness and ours. I believe it is preparing for something. I believe it is preparing for the moment when the permafrost finally melts and it can finally emerge. And I believe I'm going to have to go back. The voice is growing stronger. The compulsion is becoming irresistible. Soon I'll find myself sleepwalking toward the airport, booking a flight to Alaska, driving north toward Prudhoe Bay, walking out into the tundra to finally meet face to face with the thing that has been calling to me from inside the ice. The most terrifying part is that I'm not sure if I want to resist anymore. The voice has become familiar. It has become comforting. The thought of finally understanding its message, of finally joining with the consciousness beneath the ice, is becoming more appealing than the thought of resisting. I'm losing my grip on my own humanity. I'm slowly becoming something else, something the permafrost is making me into. I'm telling this story because I need someone to know what is happening. I need someone to understand that the permafrost isn't just a geological formation. It is a prison. It is a seal containing something that shouldn't be disturbed. It is a barrier that is being deliberately broken down by forces I don't to fully comprehend. And when that barrier finally fails, when the ancient voice emerges from beneath the ice, everything will change. The voice is asking me to come home. Home to the north, home to the frozen ground, home to the darkness beneath the permafrost where something vast and conscious and utterly inhuman is waiting to finally make contact with the modern world. I don't know how much longer I can resist its call. I don't know how much longer I'll remain myself. The sleepwalking episodes are becoming more frequent. The visions are becoming more detailed. The voice is growing louder in my mind. So I am asking you this. If you could hear the voice of something ancient and intelligent trapped beneath the ice, if you could understand its language and feel its consciousness reaching out across thousands of years, would you answer its call? Would you become a bridge between that ancient world and ours? Or would you fight against it, knowing that the fight would be futile, knowing that eventually the ice will melt and what lies beneath will emerge regardless of whether we willing or not? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you think I am still human. Tell me if you think there is any way to stop what is coming from the frozen depths. Story 9. Mirror Phenomenon of Fairbanks, 1989. Every mirror in Fairbanks started showing the future, and I watched my own death reflected back at me 7 hours before it happened. I saw myself hanging from a rope in my garage, my face purple and bloated, my eyes bulging out of their sockets, and I understood in that moment that there was nothing I could do to stop it, that fate had already written the ending to my story, and that knowing about it in advance was actually the cruelest punishment imaginable. The question I need you to answer in the comments is this: if you could see exactly how and when you were going to die, would you try to prevent it, or would you accept that what they've seen is inevitable? My name is David Winters, and I am 61 years old. I am a retired psychiatrist who spent 40 years working with patients who struggled with depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. I understood the human mind. I understood how trauma and despair could break a person. I understood the delicate balance between hope and hopelessness that kept most people anchored to life. But nothing in my career, nothing in my education, nothing in my entire life prepared me for what happened in Fairbanks, Alaska during the first week of March in 1989. What happened then wasn't just a psychological crisis. It was a violation of the most fundamental laws of reality itself. I had moved to Fairbanks about 2 years earlier, seeking a quieter life away from the intensity of psychiatric practice in the lower 48 states. I had rented a house in the suburbs, taken a part-time job at a local hospital, and spent most of my time reading and reflecting on the life I had lived. I was content. I was peaceful. I was not prepared for horror. The first sign that something was wrong came on March 1st, a Tuesday morning. I was getting ready for work, standing at the bathroom mirror, preparing to shave, and I saw something that made my hands go cold and my heart begin to race. My reflection was not shaving. My reflection was 3 hours in the future. I was standing in my office at the hospital, speaking with a patient. I could see my own mouth moving, could see the patient, this expression of profound relief, could see a clock on the wall showing 3:07 in the afternoon. And then the image faded, and my normal reflection returned. I blinked. I shook my head. I assumed I was experiencing some kind of hallucination, some kind of dissociative episode brought on by stress or insufficient sleep. I didn't mention it to anyone. I went to work, and at precisely 3:07 in the afternoon, I found myself in that exact office, speaking with that exact patient, the moment playing out exactly as my mirror had shown me. At first, I thought I was going insane. I increased my sleep. I cut back on coffee. I exercised more. I tried every rational explanation for what was happening. Maybe I was experiencing a form of dissociative prediction based on my subconscious pattern recognition. Maybe my mind was extrapolating from known variables to predict future events. Maybe I was simply having very detailed déjà vu experiences. But it kept happening. Every time I looked in a mirror, I saw a glimpse of my immediate future. A conversation with a colleague. A meal I would eat later that evening. A phone call I would receive. The images were always clear, always specific, always accurate, and I wasn't alone. Within a few days, the story was all over Fairbanks. People were talking about mirrors showing the future. At first, people thought it was funny. They would gather together and look into mirrors, trying to catch a glimpse of what was coming. Some people saw joyful events. A woman saw herself receiving a promotion. A man saw himself meeting someone new, someone who looked like they might be important to him. A child saw herself winning a school competition. But others saw horrifying things. A woman saw herself in a car accident, her face covered in blood, the moment of impact just seconds away. A man saw himself suffering a heart attack. An elderly person saw themselves falling down a flight of stairs and not getting back up. The creepy and unsettling nature of the visions began to sink in. People realized that the mirrors were not showing them anything. They were showing them their actual futures, moments that had already been determined, events that were absolutely certain to occur. The panic began slowly and then accelerated rapidly. Within 48 hours, the psychiatric hospital where I worked was completely overwhelmed. People were coming in with severe anxiety, panic attacks, and suicidal ideation. They had seen things in their mirrors that terrified them. They had seen things that suggested their futures held suffering and pain and death. They wanted medication. They wanted reassurance. They wanted someone to tell them that the mirrors were lying, that they were hallucinating, that their futures were not actually written in stone. I tried to help them. I tried to provide rational explanations. I suggested that the phenomenon might be mass hysteria, shared delusion, some kind of atmospheric or environmental factor affecting everyone's perception simultaneously. I suggested that people might be projecting their fears onto ambiguous mirror images, seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. But I knew I was lying, because I had seen my mirror visions come true with 100% accuracy, every single time. By March 3rd, stores were being looted. People were boarding up their houses. People were destroying their mirrors, smashing them with hammers and axes, as though by destroying the mirrors, they could prevent the futures that had been revealed to them. But it didn't matter. Any reflective surface could show the visions. Window glass, still water, polished metal, there was no escape from the knowledge of what was coming. And then the suicide started. The first person to die was a man named Robert Chen. According to reports, he had seen in a mirror that he was going to experience a drawn-out, painful death from a terminal illness. The vision had shown him wasting away in a hospital bed over a period of several years. He couldn't bear the thought of that suffering. He couldn't accept knowing that his future held only pain and deterioration. So he took a bottle of pills and a bottle of whiskey, and he ended his life on March 3rd in the evening. He was not the last. Over the next 4 days, more than 20 people took their own lives in Fairbanks. Some of them had seen horrible deaths in their mirrors. Some of them had seen accidents. Some of them had simply seen nothing in their mirrors at all, and that emptiness was terrifying enough to drive them to despair. The terrible knowledge that their futures were blank, that they might have no future at all, was too much for their fragile psyches to handle. The state police brought in additional personnel. The National Guard was called in to help manage the crisis. The governor declared a state of emergency. People were being hospitalized against their will to prevent them from harming themselves. Psychotropic medications were being dispensed by the handful, but nothing could stop the phenomenon. Nothing could prevent people from seeing their futures in their mirrors. And I was getting sicker. Each time I looked in a mirror, I saw the same thing. I saw myself, 7 hours in the future, hanging from a rope in my garage. I saw my bloated, purple face. I saw my feet dangling above the concrete floor. I saw the terrible finality of that image, and I felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew it was going to happen. I tried to prevent it. I removed the rope from my garage. I locked myself in the hospital. I had people watch me constantly. But somewhere deep inside my consciousness, I knew that none of it mattered. The future I had seen in my mirror was absolutely certain. It was going to happen. All of my attempts to prevent it were merely delaying the inevitable. On March 7th, I was sitting in my office at the hospital when I realized I had only a few hours left before the image in my mirror became my reality. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Not peaceful, not resigned, but calm in the way that you become calm when you know that a terrible thing is about to happen and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. And that is when I realized something terrifying about the phenomenon. The mirrors weren't predicting the future. They were creating it. They were showing people what was going to happen. And by showing them, they were making it absolutely certain that it would happen. Because once you knew the future with certainty, once you saw it reflected back at you in perfect detail, you couldn't escape it. You couldn't change it. You could only live toward it, knowing every moment that it was coming, unable to deviate from the path that had been shown to you. I began to investigate the phenomenon more carefully. I looked at everyone who had died by suicide. I looked at everyone who had seen horrifying visions in their mirrors. And I realized that there was a pattern. The people who had seen positive things, joyful futures, they had survived. They had adapted to the knowledge. The people who had seen negative things, suffering and death, they had killed themselves rather than live toward that future. But the truly terrifying realization was that everyone who had seen negative things had died exactly as they had seen it in their mirrors. No one had been able to change their fate. Everyone had gone toward their future exactly as it had been shown to them. My hospital director, a man named Dr. Paulson, called me into his office. He looked exhausted. He looked like someone who had been pushed beyond his ability to cope. He told me that he had been receiving reports of something extraordinary happening in the city. He said that everyone who had a clear vision in their mirror had experienced that exact future. Those who had seen positive events had experienced positive events. Those who had seen themselves dying had experienced death exactly as envisioned. He asked me if I thought the mirrors were showing actual predetermined futures, or if I thought there was some kind of psychological mechanism at work. I wanted to give him a rational answer. I wanted to reassure him that this was something we could understand and explain. But I couldn't. I knew the truth. The mirrors were showing something real, something terrible, something that violated every law of physics and causality that I understood. That evening, I went home. I had maybe 2 hours left before 7 o'clock, before the moment I had seen in my mirror arrived. I could have driven away from Fairbanks. I could have gone to the hospital and submitted myself for observation. I could have done any number of things to try to prevent the inevitable. Instead, I sat in my living room and thought about my life. I thought about the patients I had helped over my career. I thought about the suicides I had prevented, the moments where I had talked someone down from the edge of despair. I thought about how cruel it would be to live in a world where you could see your own death coming toward you, where you could do nothing to stop it, where you could only watch as fate drew inexorably closer. And I understood something that I had not understood before. I understood why people were choosing to take their own lives. Not because they were cowardly, not because they were weak, but because when you know for certain that your future holds suffering, when you have seen it reflected back at you in perfect detail, then the only agency you have left is the choice of how you meet that future. You can change it, but you can choose how you die. I had planned to follow the pattern. I had planned to hang myself at 7 o'clock, exactly as I had seen in my mirror. I had gone through the motions. I had prepared the rope. I had set up the garage, but something stopped me. At 6:45, I received a phone call. It was a patient from years ago, someone I had worked with in Seattle. She had heard about the phenomenon in Fairbanks on the news. She had heard that I was there. She wanted to tell me something. She wanted to tell me that 23 years earlier, I had talked her out of a suicide attempt. She had seen in her mirror that she was going to kill herself, and she had tried to do it, and I had stopped her. She had gone on to have a family. She had gone on to have a career. She had gone on to have a life filled with joy and meaning. She wanted me to know that my intervention had mattered, that even though the mirror had shown her a future where she died, I had given her a different future. I understood then what was happening. The mirrors were not showing predetermined futures. They were showing the most probable futures, the futures that would most certainly occur if nothing else happened to change them. But futures could be changed. Futures could be altered. The knowledge of what was coming was not a certainty. It was a challenge. It was an invitation to change. I put down the rope. I walked away from my garage, and at 7 o'clock, I was not hanging from a rope. I was standing in my living room, very much alive, having consciously chosen to deviate from the future I had been shown. The mirror phenomenon in Fairbanks lasted for exactly 1 week. On March 8th, it simply stopped. Mirrors went back to showing normal reflections. The vision ceased. Nobody in the scientific community has ever been able to explain what happened. The incident was largely buried and forgotten, dismissed as mass hysteria or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that scientists didn't quite understand. But I know what happened. I know that for 1 week, people in Fairbanks were shown their futures, and most of them chose to accept those futures as inevitable. Most of them chose to live toward the horror they had seen. Most of them chose to die exactly as they had been shown. But some of us, a small few, chose differently. We chose to question whether what we had seen was actually inevitable. We chose to believe that the future was not written in stone. We chose to fight against the knowledge we had been given and to try to create a different outcome. I'm telling you this story now because I believe that we all live with mirrors every day. We look at our lives and we see patterns that suggest certain futures. We see ourselves on paths that lead to specific destinations. We see our deaths approaching, and most of us accept those visions as inevitable. Most of us walk toward the futures we imagine for ourselves. But what I learned in Fairbanks is that the future is not fixed. The future is not written. The future is something that we create through our choices, through our actions, through our refusal to accept the visions that terrify us. My final question for you is this: if you could see your future reflected in a mirror, if you could know with certainty what was coming, would that knowledge make you change your life? Or would it convince you that change was impossible? Tell me in the comments what you think.